So we talked about what VPNs generally can't do and how they're being misrepresented, but in this video I want to talk more about what they're more commonly used for and their advantages over the alternative ways of connecting through things remotely. So something that's becoming a lot more common is work from home or working remotely. And depending on the business and the organization, this can vary a lot in terms of how it looks. But generally you can imagine it like this. You can say that this right here is your house, and this right over here is the business or the organization that you're working with. And you can say that the employee here needs to be able to access these servers, for example, remotely in order to do their job. But when it comes to actually implementing this remote policy, it gets a bit more tricky. Because you can imagine that there's various different servers like Active Directory so they can log in, a file server that contains proprietary or confidential files, some management software on a server that needs to interact with other servers potentially. There's a lot of things that need to be able to be accessed by that employee, and ultimately it needs to somehow be accessible through the internet. One way they can do it is they can configure their firewall to allow access to certain ports on these servers. So for example, if this computer over here sends a request on a certain port, it gets redirected into the router and gets sent down to whatever server it needs to go to. The disadvantage for this is you have to basically create multiple holes in the firewall to allow these servers to be accessed remotely by the computer here. And in doing that, the more holes you make in the firewall, the weaker it becomes. And you're also exposing the services like this on the internet. And this could be a major problem because imagine, for example, Active Directory, there's a new exploit for Active Directory that, if you can have access to it through the internet, you can potentially take over the Active Directory server or inject records into it or something. So if the Active Directory server is visible on the internet in the open, basically, then a malicious actor could come in from the internet somewhere and target attacks directly onto that server, which is visible on the internet. So at best, this is extremely risky to do. At worst, it could potentially compromise the entire business or network. If a hacker comes in and exploits something with Active Directory or the file server or whatever, they could potentially take over the server and then use that as a jump-off point to attack the other services on the network. So instead of doing that and opening these servers up potentially to being attacked, instead, what commonly happens with larger businesses and government work is they will give you a company or government-issued laptop. And inside that laptop is a VPN configuration. And what will happen is you'll have this laptop with your login information from the company. Use that to then establish a VPN link between the laptop and the VPN server. The advantage of doing this is now, instead of opening up a port for each of these servers, now all you need to do is open up a single port for the VPN server. And what will happen as if you log into the VPN is the traffic will originate on the laptop and then get encrypted by the VPN, which I'll make blue. That encrypted traffic goes to the internet, through the firewall, through the router, to the VPN server. And when it gets to the VPN server, it's then going to decrypt the data, and then it will relay that data around the network. So even though physically this is the path that the data takes to the network, what you can logically say is that by using a VPN, what you're doing is actually taking your laptop and connecting it directly to the network of that business. So you can almost kind of imagine it being like, if you have a super long Ethernet cable, miles and miles long, and you take that and you run it from your laptop all the way to the business and plug into their network. That's basically the equivalent of using a VPN in this way. And from a security standpoint, it's far, far more advisable to do it this way, because now instead of putting all these servers on the network and potentially opening them up as targets, now all you have to worry about really is the VPN server. The VPN server is going to do all of the heavy lifting when it comes to the security, because in effect, it is the gatekeeper to this. Like, it is what's allowing this laptop to connect to the network. So far, we've only talked about client-to-site VPNs, which means you have a client access point here, which is connecting to the VPN, which is considered to be the site. So here's client to the site. But there's also another kind of VPN called a site-to-site VPN. And site-to-site VPNs you actually will find in large hospital networks and larger businesses like that, where they need to connect multiple networks together that may not be geographically very close to each other. So imagine that we have a business, and this business, for example, has 3 different offices. It has a US, Australia, and Finland office. Now, these 3 offices are geographically very, very far away from each other. So there's not really a physically possible way to directly connect the 3 offices together. But these offices need to be able to share data with each other. A lot of it may be confidential or maybe protected legally in some way. But the only way to transfer the data between these offices is going to be through the internet. So if these offices need to share a lot of data or a lot of services with each other, it'd be really helpful if we could somehow bridge the networks between these 3 offices so that they all share the same network. And this is the purpose of a site-to-site VPN, as opposed to a client-site VPN. With a client-site VPN, you're usually just connecting a single client to a larger network. But with a site-to-site VPN, you're taking the entire organization and linking them together. This also changes where the VPN is actually being run. Instead of it being run on each separate computer in this organization, now the organization has usually a network appliance that handles the VPN for the entire office. That VPN appliance will then establish connections between the other offices. And each of these offices will have their own VPN appliance. And the way that the topology works for VPNs in a clustered environment like this can differ. For example, it could take the hub and spoke. So you have maybe the US office is the central office, and then the VPNs all go through the US office. Or it could be a mesh office where you have the VPN connecting all of them together like this. But that's kind of getting ahead of ourselves. The main takeaway for this is that the site-to-site VPN allows us to take, for example, these 3 separate offices and have them logically joined onto the same network, but going through the internet. And this allows all 3 offices to share data securely with each other and access each other's services.